The sun had barely risen when Ethan got the call. It was early morning, and the world outside seemed calm, as though nothing was out of place. But as soon as he heard the news, the ground beneath his feet seemed to disappear. His father had passed away. Just like that. It wasn't expected. It wasn't planned. It was sudden, a shock that left Ethan unable to breathe. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. His father, the one person who had always been there, was now gone. Ethan had never imagined life without him, and now he had no choice but to face it. His father had been the center of his world, a hard-working man who had raised Ethan with care and love. Ethan remembered the late-night talks they had, the moments of laughter that seemed to fill their home. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, yet they still burned brightly in his memory. He could still hear his father's voice in his head, still remember the way his father had always known how to make everything better. But now, that voice was silent, and Ethan was alone. The funeral was quiet, a small ceremony with only close family members attending. His father hadn't been a man of many friends, but those who had known him understood the deep loss that everyone was feeling. Ethan could barely focus as he stood there, trying to process everything. His mind kept drifting back to the call, the sound of those words, "Your father is gone." After the ceremony, Ethan returned to the house he had grown up in. The house felt different now. The walls, once full of warmth and life, now seemed cold and empty. His heart ached as he walked through each room, memories flashing before his eyes. He had always imagined his father's presence lingering in the house forever, but now it felt like a ghost haunted every corner. But there was something else, something strange. His stepmother, Zyla, had been standing by his side throughout the entire day. She was calm, collected, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. Zyla had always been a bit of a mystery to him, but today she seemed more distant than ever. Her face was unreadable, as if she were a stranger. She had never been the warmest person, but this was different. Ethan remembered the first time he met Zyla. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She had an otherworldly presence, almost as if she didn't quite belong. There was something about her eyes, something that seemed to hint at secrets she wasn't sharing. At first, Ethan had dismissed it. She was his father's new wife, after all. But now, in the quiet after his father's death, Ethan was beginning to wonder if he had missed something. Zyla had always been a bit too perfect, too composed. She never showed much emotion, and her actions always seemed carefully calculated. It was as though she was hiding behind a mask that she had worn for years. But today, it was different. She seemed detached, more than usual. Ethan tried to talk to her as they sat together in the living room. The house was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It felt like time had slowed down. Ethan's voice felt small as he spoke. "Zyla," he began hesitantly, unsure of how to phrase it. "Are you okay?" Her eyes met his, but there was no warmth in them, no familiarity. She gave a small nod, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied softly. "It's just hard, you know. Your father's death. It's difficult for all of us." Ethan stared at her for a moment. The words felt hollow. She didn't seem sad. She didn't seem upset. She didn't even seem to care. At least not in the way he expected. The woman who had been married to his father for years was acting like a stranger, and it made Ethan uncomfortable. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. As the evening wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Zyla was acting in a way that didn't make sense. She was too quiet, too reserved. She kept to herself, as if she had already moved on from the death of his father. While everyone else was grieving, she seemed almost detached from it all, as though it didn't affect her in the slightest. It wasn't until late that night that Ethan began to understand just how much things had changed. As he walked past Zyla's bedroom, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. A soft light flickered from within, and for some reason, Ethan felt a strange pull to enter. He hesitated for a moment before quietly pushing the door open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. Zilla was standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and unblinking. She didn't even seem to notice Ethan standing there. But it wasn't just her coldness that unsettled him. It was the strange, almost unnatural aura around her. It was as though she wasn't fully there, as though something about her was different. Ethan didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear. Zilla wasn't the same person she had been before. Something had changed, and he didn't know why. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore it. Something wasn't right, and Ethan was determined to find out what had happened to his stepmother, the woman who had once been a part of his family, but now seemed more like a stranger. As he turned away from her door, Ethan's mind raced with questions. What had caused Zilla to change so suddenly? And why was she acting this way? Was it grief, or was there something darker at play? Little did he know, the answers he was searching for would lead him into a world he never could have imagined. A world where nothing was as it seemed. Ethan woke up the next morning with a feeling of unease that lingered from the night before. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that almost felt unnatural. It wasn't just the stillness of the morning. It was the weight of something unspoken, something hanging in the air that he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had barely managed to sleep. His thoughts kept racing. Thoughts about his father, his stepmother, and everything that had happened in the past few days. The death of his father had shaken him to his core, but there was something deeper now. Zilla, his stepmother, had changed, and it wasn't just because of grief. There was something else going on, something far more unsettling. Ethan's mind kept going back to the moment the night before, when he had found her standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. He had only seen her for a brief moment, but that brief moment had been enough. There was something strange about her expression. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and almost empty, as if she wasn't fully there. He had never seen her like that before. She had always been distant, yes, but this was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that Zilla was hiding something. Was it just grief? Ethan didn't think so. Grief was a natural reaction, something that everyone went through. But Zilla wasn't grieving like everyone else. She wasn't showing any emotion, not even sadness. She was cold, detached, as if his father's death didn't affect her at all. In fact, it felt like she was almost unaffected by anything anymore. It was as if she had shut off entirely. The more Ethan thought about it, the more questions he had. Was Zilla really who she said she was? What was her true connection to his father? Ethan had always found her a little strange, but he had never questioned her before. She had been his stepmother for years, and he had accepted her as part of the family. But now, everything was different. He decided to take action. He couldn't just sit back and do nothing while everything around him started to feel like it was slipping out of control. Ethan needed answers. So, after a quiet breakfast, he waited for Zilla to be alone. She was sitting in the living room, staring at the television, her face expressionless. She didn't seem to notice him at first, and for a moment, he wondered if she even saw him anymore. "Zilla," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. She turned her head slowly, her eyes focusing on him with a strange, almost detached look. "Yes, Ethan." Her voice was calm, but it sounded distant, cold even. "Can we talk?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a normal conversation. This was about something deeper, something he needed to understand. Zilla didn't reply right away. She simply nodded, motioning for him to sit down beside her. Ethan hesitated for a moment before taking a seat. As he did, he noticed how stiff she seemed, how her movements were slow, almost deliberate. It was as if she was carefully controlling everything she did. "Zilla, what's going on?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're not acting like yourself. Ever since Dad passed, you've been different, and I can't help but feel like you're hiding something from me." For a long moment, Zilla didn't speak. She just stared at him, her eyes empty, calculating. Ethan couldn't read her expression. There was no emotion there, no sign of the woman he had known. It was like she was a stranger, and that scared him. "You don't understand," Zyla finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think you know everything, but you don't. There's more to this than you realize." Ethan frowned, his pulse quickening. "More? What are you talking about?" Zyla leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. "Your father wasn't just a regular man, Ethan," she said, her voice still eerily calm. "He was involved in things that you don't know about, things that I can't explain right now." Ethan's mind raced. What was she talking about? His father, involved in things. What could she possibly mean? "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "What do you mean? What's going on, Zyla?" Zilla finally looked at him, her gaze intense and piercing. For the first time, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper, something hidden. "Your father knew a lot of things, Ethan. He knew about the world, the real world, the one that exists beyond what you can see. And now that he's gone, I'm the only one left to deal with it." Ethan was stunned. He couldn't wrap his head around what she was saying. Was this some kind of twisted joke, or was she finally losing it, like some kind of grief-stricken widow? "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Zilla sighed and closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. "There's a reason I'm here, Ethan," she said slowly. "A reason I married your father. It wasn't just because of love or anything like that. It's because of what he was involved in. And now, because of you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Because of me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zyla nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "You're not just any ordinary human. You're connected to something much bigger than you know. Your father's death. It was just the beginning of something much more dangerous. And now, I'm going to have to protect you from it." Ethan's mind was spinning. This wasn't the Zilla he had known. This wasn't the woman who had always kept a distance from him, but never like this. Something had changed, and it wasn't just because of grief. Something far darker was at play, and Ethan had no idea what to believe anymore. As he sat there, trying to process what she had just said, he couldn't help but feel that his life had just shifted into something unrecognizable. Whatever was happening, whatever secret his father had been involved in, it was now his responsibility. And with that realization came a terrifying thought. Zyla was the key, but she wasn't here to protect him. She was here to control what came next. Ethan couldn't shake the weight of Zyla's words. "You're connected to something much bigger than you know." What did she mean by that? He'd always felt like an ordinary kid, raised in a home like any other, with struggles and triumphs. But now, everything was shifting. Reality itself felt like it was breaking apart. His father's death had opened a door that Ethan had no idea even existed. And now he was standing on the other side, unsure of what to expect. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as he left the room, but the dread didn't leave him. It clung to him like a shadow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan tried to go about his normal routine, attending school, pretending to be normal. But everything seemed wrong. Even the small things felt out of place. His friends had noticed he was distant, and the teachers seemed to look at him with a pity he couldn't explain. The grief from losing his father was still there, but it wasn't just grief anymore. It was something else, something that gnawed at his insides. When he returned home, he found the house strangely quiet again. Zyla was nowhere to be seen. His instincts told him to search for her, but part of him felt like he was being dragged into something he couldn't understand. He wanted answers, but he was terrified of what those answers might be. As the evening approached, Ethan decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The streets were calm, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple as the sun set, but as he walked through the neighborhood, he couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. It was a feeling that made his skin crawl, like someone, or something, was watching him. He tried to ignore it, but his nerves were on edge. The walk was supposed to calm him, but it only made him feel more unsettled. His thoughts kept drifting back to Zila and her cryptic words. What had his father been involved in? And why was Zila acting so strangely? She wasn't the same woman he had known for years. It was like she was hiding something big. Just as Ethan turned a corner to head back home, he heard a noise behind him. A rustling sound, like something brushing against the ground. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the fading light of the sunset casting long shadows across the pavement. He quickly continued walking, but the feeling didn't go away. The unease had escalated to something more, something primal. It was like his very instincts were screaming at him to be careful. He quickened his pace, making his way back toward the house. By the time he reached the door, his hands were shaking. Inside, Zila was waiting for him. But there was something different about her. She was sitting in the living room again. But now, her posture was unnaturally rigid. Her gaze was locked on the door, as if she had been waiting for him all along. Her eyes flicked up when he entered, and for the briefest moment, Ethan saw something in them that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just coldness. It was something darker, something more calculating. "You're back," Zila said, her voice oddly neutral. "Did you get some fresh air?" Ethan didn't trust himself to answer immediately. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "Zila," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "What do you mean by everything you said? What does my father have to do with whatever's happening?" Zila didn't reply right away. She simply sat there, as though contemplating something. Ethan couldn't decide whether she was planning her next words carefully or whether she was toying with him. She finally spoke, but her voice was quieter this time, as though she was speaking to herself. "The truth," she began slowly, "isn't something you're ready for, but you will be. Soon." The way she said it sent a chill through his spine. She wasn't just being cryptic for the sake of it. There was something else beneath her words, a hidden meaning that he couldn't quite grasp. "What do you mean, ready for it? I deserve to know the truth. You can't keep hiding things from me." Zila's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to sharpen. She stood up abruptly, her movements swift and almost too perfect, like she was no longer human but something else entirely. For the first time, Ethan felt fear, not just of the unknown, but of her. There was something unnatural about her, something that went beyond her cold demeanor. "You are ready," she said, her voice like a whisper in the dark. "But it's not just about knowing. It's about survival. And you're going to need every bit of strength you can muster, Ethan." Her words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. He could feel the weight of them settling deep in his chest, pressing down on him until it was almost too much to bear. His heart raced, and his mind struggled to process what she was saying. "What do you mean, survival?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He could barely form the question, but the urgency in his tone couldn't be ignored. Zila stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing. "It's coming, Ethan. Everything your father knew, everything he kept hidden from you. It's all coming for you now." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The shock was overwhelming. What was coming for him? And why now? His father's death was supposed to be the worst of it. But now, it felt like the real danger had just begun. Zila's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of something else. It was a flash of fear. Was it possible that Zila was scared too? "You're not safe here, Ethan," she said quietly. "You need to leave. It's the only way to protect yourself." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What was happening? Was he just supposed to leave his home, the only place he had left that felt familiar? But something in Zila's voice told him that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. The fear in her eyes wasn't just for show. He had to make a choice, and that choice would determine everything from here on out. Would he stay and try to fight whatever dark force was closing in on him? Or would he leave and trust Zyla, the woman who had just told him to run? Whatever he decided, it was clear that his life would never be the same again. Ethan's mind raced. The words, "It's coming for you," echoed in his head like a constant drumbeat. He had no idea what Zyla meant by that, but he knew one thing. His entire life had changed in an instant. The world he knew no longer made sense. It was as if someone had pulled back a veil, revealing a side of reality that he never even imagined existed. The sense of unease in the pit of his stomach deepened. Zyla's cold, emotionless eyes met his, and Ethan could see a flicker of something deeper within them, something he couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Was Zyla truly scared? She had always been so controlled, so perfect, but right now she was on edge. Ethan didn't trust her completely, but something told him that she wasn't lying. Maybe she was just as trapped in this unknown world as he was. "Zyla," Ethan said, his voice shaky but determined. "What's really going on here? What did my father do? Why is this happening to me?" Zyla's expression shifted slightly, as if she was considering whether to tell him more. She glanced at the door as though making sure no one else was listening, then looked back at him with a hard, unwavering gaze. "Your father was part of something much bigger than you can imagine," she said slowly, her voice low. "Something dangerous, and now that he's gone, the truth is coming for you. You have no choice but to face it." Ethan's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? What was he involved in? Zyla took a deep breath, her eyes momentarily flicking to the ceiling, as if searching for the right words. She seemed to hesitate, as though there was something she wanted to say but couldn't bring herself to. After a long silence, she spoke again, this time with more conviction. "There are forces in this world, forces beyond human understanding, that your father was tied to. And those forces don't care that he's dead. They will come for you now." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. He had heard rumors, whispers from people who had crossed paths with his father, but nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary. His father was just a man. A good man. So why was Zyla telling him this? Was it possible that his father had been hiding something from him his entire life? "Why didn't he tell me?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't he warn me?" Zyla's face softened for the briefest moment, but the hardness quickly returned. "Because your father was protecting you. He knew you weren't ready. And maybe you still aren't, but the time has come." Ethan was lost in a sea of confusion. Everything he thought he knew about his father was being ripped apart, piece by piece. How could someone so ordinary, so loving, be involved in something so dark, so dangerous? And why was it coming for him? Was he just a pawn in some game he couldn't even comprehend? Zyla took a step toward him, her voice lowering further. "It's not just about your father anymore. It's about you, Ethan. You have a role to play in all of this, whether you want it or not." Ethan recoiled, taking a step back. "What role? What do you mean?" Zyla looked at him as though she were searching for something in his eyes, something that would tell her whether he was ready to hear the truth. She took a deep breath and spoke again, her words heavy with a weight that made Ethan's heart race. "You're not just human, Ethan. You're part of something far older, far more powerful than you could ever imagine." The statement hung in the air like a thick fog, and Ethan couldn't find the words to respond. His mind was spinning, trying to process what Zyla had just said. He wasn't just human. Was she implying that he was something else, something alien? The thought made his skin crawl. He couldn't even wrap his head around the idea. Before he could say anything, Zyla turned her back to him and walked to the window, staring out into the darkening night. "You have abilities, Ethan. Abilities that were passed down to you, just as they were passed down to your father. But you don't know how to use them yet. And right now, you don't have the luxury of time. The forces that are coming, they will stop at nothing to get to you. They know what you are." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What am I, Zyla? What do you mean?" Zyla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared out the window for what seemed like an eternity, as if wrestling with some inner conflict. Finally, she turned back to him, her face hard as stone. "You are part of a bloodline that connects back to an ancient civilization," she said, her voice steady. "A civilization that was lost to time, lost because it was too dangerous. Your father was part of a group tasked with keeping that knowledge hidden. But now you're the last of that bloodline, Ethan, and you must protect it. Because if the wrong people get their hands on you, the world as we know it could change forever." Ethan felt his head spin. A lost civilization. Ancient bloodlines. What was Zila talking about? Nothing about his life made sense anymore. He was just a normal kid, or so he thought. There was no way he was connected to something so big, so terrifying. But the look in Zyla's eyes told him that she wasn't lying. The fear in her voice, the rawness of it, was enough to convince him that she was telling him the truth. But if this was the truth, what was he supposed to do with it? How could he fight something he didn't even understand? Zila stepped closer to him, her eyes intense. "You have to decide, Ethan. Will you stand up and fight, or will you let everything your father worked for crumble? Because the force is coming for you. They won't wait. And neither will I." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and his hands began to shake. He had no choice. He had to find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. He was in this now, whether he was ready or not. "Okay," Ethan said, his voice firm with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. "I'll fight. I'll find out what's going on. But I need answers. And I need them now." Zyla nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to say those words. "Good. Then let's get started." The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Ethan's life was about to change forever, and he was going to have to find the strength to face whatever came next, whether he was ready or not. Ethan sat in stunned silence, his mind racing with questions that had no clear answers. The weight of Zyla's revelation pressed down on him like a crushing force. The lost civilization. An ancient bloodline. How could he, a regular teenager, be connected to something so massive? But deep down, something about it felt right. It explained the odd sensations he had felt all his life, the moments where time seemed to slow down around him, the strange dreams filled with symbols he didn't understand, the unshakable feeling that he was being watched. His whole life, he had been different, but he never knew why. Zyla watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said, her voice quieter now. "But we don't have much time. They're coming, Ethan. They know who you are." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "Who are they?" he asked, forcing himself to look directly into her piercing, almost inhuman eyes. "What do they want from me?" Zila exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. "They call themselves the Elders, but don't be fooled by the name. They are not wise men, nor are they guardians of knowledge. They are conquerors, destroyers. They are the reason your ancestors vanished. Your father spent his life keeping their secrets from them, hiding the last remnants of the civilization they obliterated. And now they know you exist." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why me?" His voice wavered, but he didn't look away. "If they wiped out my ancestors, why would they care about me? I don't even know who I am." Zila stepped closer, her presence almost overwhelming. "Because you are the last key," she said. "You carry the last traces of something they failed to destroy. And if they get to you, they will finish what they started." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. He wanted to argue, to call her a liar, to reject the insane idea that his life had suddenly turned into a battle between ancient civilizations. But he couldn't deny the truth in her eyes, or the memories stirring deep inside him. Flashes of something he couldn't explain, memories that weren't his, rushed through his mind. A city of towering crystal spires beneath a twin-sun sky. Voices speaking a language he had never heard but somehow understood. And a symbol, glowing, pulsing. A mark burned into the very fabric of his existence. His hands trembled as he looked down at them. He could almost feel something shifting beneath his skin, something waking up. Zyla saw it too. "It's starting," she murmured. Ethan's breath came fast. "What's starting?" Zilla took his wrist in her grasp, flipping his palm upward. "The awakening. Your abilities, your connection to your ancestors. It's been dormant. But now, it's waking up. And once it does, there will be no hiding." Ethan yanked his arm back. "I didn't ask for this," he snapped. "I don't want to be a part of some ancient war. I just want my life back." His voice cracked on the last word, and the weight of everything crashed down on him all at once. His father was gone. His entire existence was built on secrets. And now he was being hunted by something he didn't even understand. Zyla's expression remained cold, but for the first time, there was something else beneath it. Pity. Maybe even regret. "I know," she said, "but it's too late. You don't get to choose." Ethan turned away, pressing his fingers into his temples, trying to force his mind to make sense of it all. He wanted to scream, to run, to wake up and find out this was all just a nightmare. But it wasn't. And then, something changed. A sharp pressure filled the air, making Ethan's ears pop. The walls trembled slightly, as if the entire house had taken a deep breath. Zyla went rigid, her head snapping toward the door. "They're here," she whispered. Ethan barely had time to react before the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A deep, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through his bones. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally, creeping toward them. His pulse pounded. "Who's here?" Zilla turned to him, her voice urgent. "Run." A deafening crash echoed through the house as the front door exploded inward. Ethan's breath caught as he saw them. Figures silhouetted against the dim glow of the hallway, their bodies unnaturally elongated, their eyes gleaming like molten silver. They weren't human. They had found him. Zyla didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ethan's wrist and pulled him toward the back of the house. "Move," she commanded. Ethan's legs barely worked, but he forced himself to run, his heart hammering. The walls seemed to close in as they ran through the house, shadows slithering toward them like living things. The air grew thick, humming with an unseen energy that sent static crawling over his skin. Behind them, the figures stepped into the room. One of them raised a hand, and the very air around them warped, bending like heat waves. Zilla turned sharply, raising her own hand. A pulse of blue light shot from her palm, colliding with the distorted air. A sharp crack split the silence as the forces clashed. Ethan barely had time to process what he was seeing. Zyla was fighting them with abilities beyond anything he could comprehend. And then, pain. Searing, white-hot pain tore through Ethan's skull. He staggered, gasping, as visions flooded his mind. A city in flames. A great war. A symbol, glowing with an ancient power. And a voice that sent chills down his spine. Find the source. End the bloodline. Ethan collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Zilla crouched beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Ethan, stay with me." But the pain was unbearable, his vision blurred, his body shaking. And then, everything went black. Darkness wrapped around Ethan like a suffocating veil. He was weightless, floating in an endless void. Time didn't seem to exist here. No sound, no light, just an eternal nothingness. And yet, he wasn't alone. A voice echoed in the abyss, deep and resonant, vibrating through his very being. "You cannot hide from what you are." Ethan tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. A pulse of energy rippled through the void, and suddenly, images flashed before his eyes. His father's face, the golden symbol glowing in his palm, Zyla standing between him and the inhuman figures that had crashed into his home. Then the image shifted. He saw a great war, towering structures crumbling into dust, A sea of beings, some humanoid, others monstrous, locked in battle beneath twin burning suns. And in the center of it all stood a single figure, cloaked in a shimmering light, his face obscured. But Ethan could feel it, an undeniable connection. The figure turned, and though Ethan couldn't see his face, he felt the weight of a gaze that seemed to pierce his very soul. "Wake up," Ethan gasped, his body jerking as his consciousness slammed back into reality. Pain seared through his skull, his lungs burning as if he had been drowning and just now surfaced. He was lying on a cold metal floor, the scent of ozone, and something sterile filling his nostrils. A faint, bluish light flickered above him. He groaned, pushing himself up on shaky arms. His body ached all over, but it wasn't just pain. It was something deeper, something wrong. His very essence felt like it had been tampered with. "You're awake." Zyla's voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it. Ethan turned his head and saw her standing near a control panel, her fingers flying across glowing interfaces. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Zyla didn't look at him as she continued working. "A holding facility. The elders took you after you collapsed. We don't have much time before they realize I've overridden their security." Ethan's stomach twisted. The elders. They were in my head. He pressed his temples, the memory of the voice in the void still echoing inside him. They were showing me something. A war. A symbol. A man cloaked in light. Zyla froze. Her hand stopped moving over the control panel, and for the first time, her expression changed from determination to something Ethan had never seen before. "Fear." "What did you say?" she whispered. Ethan swallowed. "I saw a man. He was at the center of it all." Zyla stepped closer, studying his face intently. "Did you see his eyes?" Ethan frowned. I don't know. His face was hidden, but I could feel him looking at me." Zyla exhaled sharply, stepping back as if she had seen a ghost. "They know," she muttered under her breath. Ethan's pulse pounded. "Who knows?" "The elders," Zyla snapped, turning back to the control panel. "They weren't just showing you memories, Ethan. They were searching." "For what?" "For proof." Ethan's mind reeled. "Proof of what?" Zyla's fingers danced across the glowing interface, and a low hum filled the air as a section of the wall began to shift. "That you are him." The words sent ice through Ethan's veins. "What are you talking about?" Zyla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved swiftly, grabbing a small cylindrical device from a nearby table and tossing it to him. "Hold on to that," she instructed. Ethan caught it instinctively, but his mind was still spinning. "What do you mean I'm him?" Zyla finally turned to face him fully. "The man you saw in your vision. The one cloaked in light. That wasn't a memory of the past." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Then what was it?" Zyla's eyes burned with intensity. "It was a warning. A glimpse of what's coming." Ethan shook his head. No, that doesn't make any sense." He looked down at his hands, the faintest trace of golden light flickering beneath his skin. "You're not just anything, Ethan," Zyla cut him off. "The elders have been looking for you for a long time. Longer than you can imagine." The wall finished shifting, revealing a dark passageway. Zyla grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward it. "We need to go. Now." Ethan's feet moved automatically, his brain still struggling to keep up. "Where are we going?" Zyla's grip tightened. "To find the truth." A blaring alarm suddenly erupted through the facility, red warning lights flashing along the walls. "They know we're escaping," Zyla growled. Ethan barely had time to react before a violent tremor shook the entire structure. And then, a voice. Not spoken, but inside his mind. "You cannot run from destiny." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. The hunt had truly begun. The facility trembled violently, red warning lights casting frantic shadows across the metallic walls. The alarm's piercing wail was deafening, but Ethan barely heard it over the thunderous pounding in his chest. Zyla gripped his wrist tightly, yanking him through the narrow passage she had revealed. "Hurry," she hissed, leading him through a dimly lit corridor. The walls pulsed with strange energy, like veins of a living organism rather than a constructed structure. "We have to reach the extraction point before the elders close in." Ethan struggled to keep up, his legs still weak from whatever had happened to him. The memory of the voice inside his head, "You cannot run from destiny," sent chills down his spine. "What do they want from me?" he demanded, his voice raw with frustration and fear. "Why am I so important?" Zyla didn't answer immediately. She came to a sudden stop before a towering circular door. The surface rippled like liquid metal, shifting in response to her presence. "You're more than just important, Ethan," she said, her gaze serious, almost reverent. "You're the last one." Ethan frowned. "The last what?" Zyla hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. The sounds of rapid footsteps echoed through the corridor behind them. They were out of time. She pressed her palm against the door, and it split apart with a soft hiss, revealing a massive chamber beyond. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The room was unlike anything he had ever seen before. At its center stood a colossal structure, a crystalline obelisk, pulsating with golden energy. It was suspended above the ground, its base hovering just inches from a circular platform covered in intricate alien symbols. The light from the obelisk bathed the entire room in a shimmering glow, illuminating a series of strange, pod-like capsules lining the walls. "This is it," Zyla whispered. Ethan took a hesitant step forward. "What is all this?" Zyla motioned toward the obelisk. "The Nexus Core, the heart of our civilization. It holds the memories, knowledge, and power of an entire species. And you," she turned to him, her gaze steady, "you are its heir." Ethan's head spun. "That's impossible. I didn't even know any of this existed until your father died," Zyla finished. "And that's not a coincidence. He was protecting you, hiding you." The weight of her words pressed down on him. His father, the man he had always known as strong, steady, human. But now, piece by piece, the truth was unraveling. Before he could respond, a deep, rumbling voice filled the chamber. "He does not belong here." The temperature dropped instantly. Ethan turned toward the source of the voice, and his breath caught in his throat. The elders had arrived. Towering figures, draped in shimmering robes, emerged from the shadows. Their faces were obscured beneath smooth, reflective masks, but their presence radiated an overwhelming force. It wasn't just their size or the eerie glow surrounding them. It was the way reality itself seemed to shift around them, as if they were bending the fabric of existence to their will. One of them stepped forward, its voice reverberating in Ethan's skull. "You have meddled for too long, Zyla." Zyla took a defensive stance. "He deserves to know the truth. He deserves nothing." The elder's voice was emotionless, cold. "He is a mistake." A pulse of energy shot from the elder's outstretched hand. Ethan barely had time to react before Zyla moved in front of him, raising her own hands. A shimmering barrier erupted between them, absorbing the attack. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the room, causing the obelisk to pulse wildly. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse racing. He was no warrior, no chosen savior. He was just a guy who had lost his father and found himself thrown into an impossible reality. But deep down, something stirred. A memory. Not his own, but ancient, buried. Flashes of battle. A symbol burning in the sky. A voice, his own, but not, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. The obelisk pulsed, and suddenly, Ethan felt something shift within him. A warmth spread through his chest, his skin tingling with unseen power. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You will know when the time comes." This was it. The elder raised its hand again, preparing to strike. But this time, Ethan didn't cower. Instinct took over. He raised his own hand, and the moment he did, the obelisk responded. A surge of golden light exploded outward, swallowing the room. The elders recoiled, their forms flickering like shadows caught in a storm. Zillah gasped, shielding her eyes. And Ethan understood. He wasn't just an heir. He was the key. And the war was far from over.